The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
Samantha Blake never suspected she was being watched. As a passionate member of the Students for a Democratic Society group, she spent her days organizing rallies, writing pamphlets, and speaking at college campuses. What she didn't know was that her every move was being tracked by the CIA. Samantha's phone was tapped, and her conversations were recorded and analyzed. The CIA wanted to know who she spoke to, what they discussed, and whether any of her contacts had connections in other countries. Her privacy was completely breached, but she remained blissfully unaware, focused on her mission to end the war. Samantha was one of hundreds of thousands of victims of one of the CIA's most controversial missions. This is the story of Operation Chaos.
But opposition to the war was growing. Voices of those objecting to U.S. involvement in Vietnam were getting louder. In May of 1970, 4 students were killed by National Guard troops during a campus protest at Kent State University in Ohio. Borg learned of the incident while he was on the air reading the news in Cedar Rapids.
We're living in the middle of a beast. Lyndon Johnson is a common murderer, and he should be arrested for murder. There are no limits to dissent. I think the peace movement should have the anger of a Vietnamese woman whose child was burned by napalm, dropped by American planes, way up there in the sky.
The mid-1960s marked the greatest escalation of the Vietnam War in a consistent but firm change in U.S. citizens' opinions towards it. At first, U.S. citizens supported the war as the best way to contain communism, but that was before the Tet Offensive of January 1969. It consisted of a series of fierce attacks by the opposing Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. This took place across South Vietnam, causing widespread destruction on the American front of the war. The government claimed that the war was almost finished, but this attack clearly contradicted prior statements. People felt betrayed.
A dangerous effort is underway in this country to confuse, to divide, to intimidate the American people.
But this was nothing compared with the revelation of the tragic My Lai attack in 1969, where U.S. soldiers attacked hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and elderly people.
Dí súng vào trong người, họ bắt 6 mẹ con tôi chui lại vào cái hầm tránh phố của gia đình. Mẹ tôi bảo các con chui vào trước, mẹ chui vào sau để mẹ cẩn thận cho các con. Mẹ tôi chui vào khỏi miệng hầm thì lính Mỹ đánh lựu đạn xuống tứ tấp. Thân xác của mẹ chị và các em tôi đã tan tành, đứa em gái út.
In the words of Army officer Colonel David H. Hackworth, you got your card punched by the number of bodies that you counted. While the U.S. Army tried to cover up the incident at first, the truth spilled out when soldiers who participated in the attack spoke out, and reporters like Seymour Hersh published its details to the public. Remember Hersh's name. It'll be really important later on. American media coverage of the war changed completely after these two events. In 1967, major newspapers began reporting all of the U.S. Army's atrocities in Vietnam. Anchorman Frank Reynolds said to his audience that our spirit as a people is scarred, and the most compelling argument yet advanced for America to end its involvement in Vietnam is not alone because of what the war is doing to the Vietnamese or our reputation abroad, but because what it is doing to us. It's safe to say that people were not pleased with the ongoing war. The widespread pictures of the My Lai attack kick-started strong anti-war protests throughout the country's college campuses, usually led by students, artists, and young adults. Of course, colleges like Columbia University became hotbeds of anti-war activism, giving birth to many organized anti-war movements such as the SDS, or Students for a Democratic Society. But no anti-war demonstration caused as much uproar in the White House as the March on the Pentagon in October of 1967. Tens of thousands of protesters involving more than 100,000 attendees rallied by the Lincoln Memorial to protest against the Vietnam War. Around 50,000 of these people marched across the Potomac River to the Pentagon, leading to a confrontation with the paratroopers on guard. This series of events culminated in the famous Flower Power picture, where protester George Harris placed a carnation flower inside the barrel of an M14 rifle. The picture was nominated for a 1967 Pulitzer Prize for its cultural influence. It humanized the protesters, presenting them as peaceful, compassionate individuals rather than radicals or troublemakers. This helped with the public perception and garnered broader support for the anti-war cause. Now, did this motivate the White House to stop the war?
We're making progress. We're satisfied with that progress. Our allies are pleased with that progress. And every country that I know in that area that is familiar with what's happening thinks it's absolutely essential that Uncle Sam keep her word and stay there until we can find an honorable peace.
Not at all. Instead, they began suspecting that these anti-war protests couldn't come from the people's genuine feelings towards the war. No, they thought these ideals had been brought into the USA by European countries or foreign governments. And in April of the same year, students at Columbia University began protesting against the university's involvement in military research by occupying several campus buildings, leading to a violent police crackdown. And no more than a month later, protests began to rise in France. The White House was definitely worried. They had to find an immediate solution to all of these demonstrations, and the best way to attack this monster was by uprooting its cause. And this is how the seeds for Operation Chaos were sown.
I am tonight appointing a special advisory commission on civil disorders. The commission will investigate the origins of the recent disorders in our cities.
In 1967, President Lyndon B. Johnson established the National Commission on Civil Disorders, widely known as the Kerner Commission. This was established to better investigate the reasons for the protests. As part of his work, the Commission's executive director requested the CIA's help with information on domestic disturbances. But this traditionally was the FBI's domain. Now back then, Richard Helms was the director of the CIA. So Helms agreed, but with the condition of only supplying information on foreign connections that caused domestic disorders. All field stations of the CIA were polled for information they had on the topic, and every branch was called to submit any information it had on the peace movement. Now, an infiltration plan titled quote-unquote Project One was drafted by one of the CIA's departments. It would recruit agents who could penetrate the Black Power and the peace movements, reporting information on the contacts, communications, travel, and plans of the people within the group. Ultimately, Director Helms ended up rejecting it because it appeared to be beyond the agency's legal powers, and backlash would be truly terrible if it ever became public knowledge. So most of the information was supplied by the FBI instead, who were conducting their own counterintelligence program titled COINTELPRO. Now, this program was targeting local civil rights organizations and leftist groups. The CIA ended up providing 26 reports to the Kerner Commission by mid-November of the same year. The study, titled International Connections of the United States Peace Movement, was completed and personally delivered to President Lyndon B. Johnson. However, no significant foreign connection with the domestic disorder was found in the study. The most they uncovered was that some U.S. activists traveled abroad to meet up with peace groups from other countries. Okay, so here's where things get more complicated. Due to each institution's legal boundaries, investigation of domestic matters only concerned the FBI, and the investigation of foreign connections only concerned the CIA. However, President Johnson determined that the CIA produced more complete actionable intel than the FBI, which is why more pressure was placed on the CIA, despite this being out of their jurisdiction. In an attempt to please the president, Helms instructed some CIA agents to keep investigating anti-war demonstrations in the United States and abroad. The next study on this was delivered to the White House on January 5, 1968, further increasing the information bank of the CIA. The operations agents sent cables to all of the CIA's field stations in July of 1968, with the order that all information concerning the dissident groups would be sent through a single restricted channel on an eye-only basis to the chief of operation. Still, the White House did not buy that communism from other countries wasn't influencing internal protests. They hypothesized that American expatriates and international communist organizations might be coordinating with and funding U.S. anti-war movements, and immediately feared that these connections could strengthen the protest against the war. So, once more, the White House requested more investigations. Director Helms commissioned the preparation of yet another analytic paper, this time titled, quote-unquote, Restless Youth. It concluded the same as its predecessor. Student protests were caused by local dissatisfaction with government's actions, and guess what? Not masterminded by communists. But here's where things start getting out of hand. Two versions of the Restless Youth document were produced. The first version of this document described domestic involvement, which was slightly out of the CIA's boundaries. Only 2 copies of this version were printed. One was delivered to President Lyndon B. Johnson, and the second to Henry A. Kissinger after the change of the presidential administration. It was attached with a covering memorandum that was, let's say, very clear as to why the paper shouldn't be made public. The memorandum stated, "In an effort to round out our discussion of the subject, we have included a section on American students. This is an area not within the charter of this agency, so I need not emphasize how extremely sensitive this makes the paper. Should anyone learn of its existence, it would prove most embarrassing for all concerned." Now, the second version of this document had the section on domestic activities deleted, and it was distributed more freely among the FBI and other intelligence agencies. President Nixon continued Operation Chaos as soon as June of 1969. Tom Charles Huston, staff assistant to the president, wrote to the CIA that previous reports indicated how the CIA lacked enough intelligence collection capabilities and that they had 10 days to provide them with an answer as to why they hadn't concluded that communist influence was causing student protests. The agency responded on June 30th, 1969, with a report entitled Foreign Communist Support to Revolutionary Protest Movements in the United States. This report concluded that, while communists did indeed encourage movements similar to the anti-war protests taking place in the US through propaganda, there was almost no evidence of communist funding and training of these movements domestically. And no matter how many sources they looked for, whether the FBI, independent means, or infiltration, no link between these two were ever found. However, the memorandum of the report mentioned that Katzenbach guidelines of 1967 prevented the agency from finding more conclusive data. For those not in the know, the Katzenbach guidelines were another memorandum that emphasized how electronic surveillance for national security purposes should only be authorized by high-ranking officials within the executive branch, such as the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General. On top of that, surveillance had to have a clear and specific national security purpose, such as gathering intelligence related to foreign espionage, terrorism, or other threats to national security. Finally, they discouraged the use of surveillance for purely domestic or political purposes, which is kind of what the White House wanted the CIA to do. So, Nixon's administration insisted that the CIA account for any gaps in the agency's administration by duplicating its staff and using more questionable methods to collect information. The investigation group was finally given the name Chaos, and with this began one of the darkest eras of domestic espionage in the United States. Now, the CIA is always incredibly strict about the security of its operations, but Helms was fully aware that this operation's legal status was on murky waters, so absolutely nothing about the operation could be known, even within the CIA. The few people at the CIA's top leadership who did know kept things close to their chest. The group participating in the operation was working out of a vaulted basement with strictly managed communications. The operation was also removed from the normal chain of command of the CIA, meaning CIA officers not involved in the project had no supervision over its activities. So its members were more prone to quote-unquote bending certain rules. Even the chief of counterintelligence, despite legally being the responsible staff member of the operation, had little to no connection with the actual operations of this initiative. That's because Helms ordered the chief of Operation Chaos to not disclose all of the operation's activities to the chief of counterintelligence, so the actual responsibility fell more on Helms' territory than any of his underlings. The chief for Chaos requested that his office be attached directly to Helms. I mean, after all, why not work right beside him if they had to keep things so secret even among their own staff? To make matters worse, there is no evidence that the CIA's General Counsel was ever consulted on the lawfulness of Operation Chaos's activities. It wasn't subject to an annual review or approval procedure as every program in the CIA was obligated to undergo. And there was also no formal review of the operation's annual budget. Many CIA senior officers were skeptical of Operation Chaos at best, and outright opposed at worst, with some division chiefs outright denying to provide the operation with information. Feelings from the CIA against Chaos were so negative that Helms had to send out a memorandum to convince CIA agents to collaborate with its activities. Quote, "Chaos is a legitimate counterintelligence function of the agency and cannot be stopped simply because some members of the organization do not like this activity." In another memorandum, Helms demanded all CIA division leaders to provide the operation any support that it needed, no matter what, and reassured CIA agents that its activities were within the legal boundaries of the agency. This, of course, was completely false. Helms increased the operations staff to 36 and then eventually 52. Now, keep in mind, this is a lot of agents for an operation tasked with domestic espionage. These operations tend to have a team fewer than a dozen people, but pressure from not just one, but two presidents led Helms to act with far less consideration for protocol than a chief of the CIA should. Chaos agents were formally trained for 2 weeks to 3 weeks, but during this time frame, they were heavily isolated. The number of people who even knew training was going on was to be kept to an absolute minimum. But here comes the most disturbing information of all: the operation's information gathering methods. Pressure from President Nixon's administration caused the operation officers to reach depths way beyond their jurisdiction to please the president. That's when things went from bad to worse. First is the mail interception tactic. Operation Chaos members had access to the CIA's New York Mail Intercept, allowing them to track and inspect people's mail items. To do this effectively, the operations analyst produced a watch list of U.S. citizens to be monitored by the staff of the Mail Intercept. Their received mail was to be sent to the Chaos headquarters for inspection. And guess how many items they collected? Well, it was enough to fill 2 filing cabinet drawers. That's an estimated 1,100 pages of materials. And by the way, the mail interception campaign wasn't terminated until Operation Chaos was. A lot of people's personal information was acquired in the process. Chaos agents also received booking slips for calls made between points in the USA and abroad. These slips didn't contain information about the call's contents, but revealed the identities of the caller and the receiver, and the date and time of the call. While these 2 actions were terrible on their own, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Remember Project 1, which was proposed infiltration within the leftist groups, but was rejected by Helms precisely because it was beyond the CIA's jurisdiction? Well, the same office that had originally developed Project 1 drafted a revised document titled Project 2. This proposed recruiting people who were affiliated with any of these anti-war protest groups and training them through a process called sheep dipping. This is where they teach these recruits all of the theory and keywords used by each specific protester group. Then, these trainees would be sent to Europe to investigate whether American expatriates were interacting with foreign protest groups supporting the idea that domestic protests in the USA were being influenced by similar groups outside of it. Their only rule was that they could not investigate domestic targets. Still sketchy, but at least there were lines that they couldn't cross yet. Except they ended up crossing them anyway. Around 23 agents were recruited for Project 2 between 1970 and 1974. Still, Project 2 case officers didn't aim for their trainees to join as activists in these anti-war groups, lest boundaries be blurred even more. But many trainees ended up doing so, with even one case that got so involved in one such group that he provided the agency with copies of transcripts of the group's meetings. Another trainee was an advisor in a United States congressional campaign and provided records of all behind-the-scenes activities in this campaign. Some of these agents were past or present FBI informants interested in foreign assignments. 18 of these referrals were recruited into Project Chaos, although only one was used on more than one assignment. The standard procedure involved the operations case officer briefing the individual on the Chaos requirements before the trip and debriefing them upon their return. Another 17 agents were referred to the operation by other CIA components, but 10 were deemed ineffective for the mission and dropped after their initial assessment. 4 of these eventually went abroad for brief trips, and the last 3 were the most important ones. Why? Well, they had entry into anti-war radical left or black militant groups before they were recruited into the operation, meaning they were the most useful for infiltration within the US. One of these was asked to travel to Washington, D.C., and to get as close as possible, or even become an assistant to radical leaders. His activities involved reporting on the group's plans and any information on planned violence toward government officials, buildings, or foreign embassies. So which of these groups were targeted? Here's just a handful of names, with some noteworthy ones being the Students for a Democratic Society, the Women's Strike for Peace, the American Indian Movement, and the Black Panther Party. The information of these agents was compiled into a document called Plans for Future Anti-War Activities on the West Coast. This agent was met 2 or 3 times a week by a Chaos case officer, with all of his information used for a contact report, usually typed late at night or over the weekends to signify how urgent they were. And if the information collected by the agent was significant, it was passed by the case officer to an FBI representative strictly through verbal communication, so as to leave 0 trails behind. They had finally crossed the one line they claimed they wouldn't cross, by explicitly spying on domestic activities and reporting on them. If this fact became public, well, things were going to look grim for the White House. In short, the pressure by the White House on the CIA had worked well. Too well, in fact, as now the Chaos agents were reporting on a lot of information that was out of the CIA's domain. Should any of this come to light in such a turbulent time where people wholly distrusted the US government, well, it wouldn't be taken lightly by the American public. But the same issue prevailed. The White House still couldn't comprehend that local anti-war protests were completely domestic. After all, how dare American citizens be horrified by the pictures of innocents butchered in cold blood or bodies burned by napalm? No, it had to be foreign propaganda. But other issues became evident quickly enough. The operation had collected a lot of raw data and lacked sufficient members to analyze and index it properly. While they indeed had many analysts to do this job, they had collected a literal mountain of information and lacked enough team members to properly organize it all. So they had to settle by categorizing it all on a need-to-know basis, going from least to most sensitive information. A special computer password was required for each information stream, almost as if it were a library card index. Files would be also divided into different levels of security. If they had enough information on a specific person, or if the person was of interest to another government agency, the analyst would open a 201 personality file. So what level of information would these files contain? This is where things get dark. You could find data such as the person's place of birth, family, occupation, and organizational affiliation. Around 7,200 separate personality files were compiled of the 300,000 names in the Chaos Files Index. But all things, whether good or bad, will come to an end. And Operation Chaos was no different. 2 key factors led to the program being abandoned. Firstly, by 1973, the White House was much less concerned with communism motivating internal protest. American participation in the Vietnam War had officially stopped, causing many anti-war protests to dwindle accordingly. On top of that, a new director of the CIA was appointed in 1973, who quickly set the record straight by sending a memorandum specifying that the CIA was not to be directly engaged in surveillance or espionage against an American abroad, altering the policy set in 1968 by Director Helms. Finally, in March of 1974, the agency officially terminated Operation Chaos. While they had crossed many lines while engaging in their activities, no one had to know the truth, and everyone could go along with their merry lives. Except, it wasn't that easy. Remember Seymour Hersh? By now, he had made a name of his own as an investigative journalist hired by the New York Times at the paper's Washington bureau, and had reported many of the U.S. dirtiest secrets, including Operation Menu, the White House's planned destabilization of the Chilean government. On December 22, 1974, Hersh exposed the operation, revealing how the government had compiled dossiers of at least 10,000 American citizens, although the government eventually revealed the real number of 300,000. So you can imagine why we stated that the operation analysts were beyond overworked. The damage was done, and ex-Director Helms' worst fear had come true. He had once predicted that Operation Chaos being exposed would cause great damage to the government's reputation, but he had no idea how destructive things would actually get. Distrust in the US government was already rampant due to the opposition toward the Vietnam War, but this was taking things to a far worse level.
Well, it's a bill that would set up a permanent oversight committee, bipartisan committee with a rotating membership.
The U.S. Senate's Church Committee investigated the operation as part of its broader inquiry into intelligence abuses, criticizing the CIA's breach of privacy and the lack of legality of their domestic activities. People were so outraged that Congress was forced to establish permanent oversight committees to monitor the activities of intelligence agencies and ensure they always complied with legal and ethical standards. Operation Chaos is a stark example of the lengths to which the U.S. government went during the Cold War to safeguard national security, often at the expense of civil liberties. I've said a lot in this video, and whether you agree or disagree with the CIA's approach, it takes nothing away from its significance as one of the most invasive and controversial CIA operations ever exposed. And so, as we part ways, remember, the quest for truth is never-ending, and the impact of governmental actions can indeed shake the foundations of our society. If you enjoyed this video and want to see another, click here. And if you want to support the channel and subscribe, click here. Until next time, keep questioning, keep challenging, and most importantly, keep watching.